In 1990, Saddam Hussein decided that he was going to invade neighbouring Kuwait. Kuwait and Iraq had been partitioned by the British after the war, and he thought that the two countries should be united, and also the temptation of this oil-rich state was just a little bit too much for him. So, in late 1990, he launched a huge invasion of Kuwait, thinking that the big powers would not respond. But America did, with its allies, and they formed a coalition to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And this started in January 1991. Now, in many ways, this was a bit like a medieval conflict, because it had limited aims. The aims of the coalition was purely to get Iraq out of Kuwait, and that was that. It wasn't for great territorial gains, it wasn't to impose an ideology onto a different country. It had very limited aim. So, in January 1991, the operation began. And it started with Operation Desert Storm. And this was a month-long bombardment of the Iraqi capital Baghdad and other key Iraqi military bases. Now, this wasn't like the Second World War with their flat carpet bombings. This was a modern bombardment. It had stealth bombers flying over with their special diagonal geometric shapes, so they couldn't be picked up by radar. There were smart bombs which were guided remotely from bunkers in America that could hit precise targets. And there were also daisy cutter bombs, and when these bombs landed, these are buildings by the way, when these bombs landed, they just sent a shock at ground level, which meant that everything, all buildings, would be destroyed. Now, such was the devastation of Operation Desert Storm that the whole Iraqi Air Force was completely decimated before it could even take off. Well, two planes did manage to take off, but in the confusion they shot each other down. And most of the Iraqi military targets, most of the coordination bases had been destroyed. Now, but because these bases were in the middle of built-up areas like Baghdad, civilian casualties were huge. Just like in any modern war, it was the civilians that bore the brunt of the casualties, not the soldiers. After this month-long bombardment, the second part of the operation kicked in, and this was called Operation Desert Sabre. And with Saudi support, the coalition had positioned huge tank armies waiting to engage with the Iraqi forces. Now, the tanks that the Americans had were highly armoured, and they were also armed with shells which had enriched uranium tips, which is extra strong metal, so it could easily puncture holes in the Iraqi tanks. The Iraqi tanks that they were fighting against were 25 years older than the coalition tanks. Their armour was half as thick. They could only fire from about a third as far away as the coalition tanks. So the Iraqis really didn't stand a chance, because they were technologically inferior. And so there was the race for Baghdad. Very soon after 3 days of fighting, Saddam Hussein ordered his troops to retreat, and they fled up the highway from Kuwait to Baghdad. Meanwhile, the coalition forces entered Iraq from Saudi Arabia, and there was what we call the race to Baghdad. Meanwhile, the coalition forces, with their superior air power, they bombed the retreating Iraqi forces, a bit like in medieval warfare when the cavalry would chase after fleeing troops from the battlefield. this was the Air Force chasing the Iraqi troops as they withdrew. And so Iraq had been pushed out of Kuwait, but the coalition, of course, left Saddam Hussein in power because that wasn't one of their war objectives. The Iraqis, by the end of the war, had lost about 20,000 soldiers, probably more tragically 50,000 Iraqi civilians had been killed. But the coalition had only lost about 350 soldiers, and half of those had been killed by friendly fire. Of course, the coalition, America, Britain, needed to keep casualties down because they'd be reported on the news every night, and populations back home would not tolerate high casualties as being seen in the Vietnam War.